In this video, we'll show you how to remove and repair rust damage on your car without welding, even if it's a big hole you can see through. Let's get to it. Rust damage often occurs on the side skirts or around the wheel wells where stones can fly up against high speeds and chip the paint, exposing the bare metal to the elements. If left untreated, it will start to rust and spread, eating away the metal until it gets so bad that you have no other choice but to replace the part entirely. So it's important to repair and stop the rust as soon as possible. As you can see, the inside looks pretty bad already with chunks of rust flaking off, but we're just in time to prevent having to weld in pieces or replace the fender. You can clearly see it from the outside. This entire area is affected and needs to be treated for rust. It's even worse on the driver's side where a hole is starting to form. Luckily, rust repair is super simple. First, you need to remove all the rust and prevent it from spreading. Then fill the holes back up with body filler. Next, sand everything smooth with the surrounding area and finally paint it to match the rest of the car. Depending on where the rust spot is, you either want to remove the adjacent plastic parts or protect them like we did. You can simply tape a wide putty knife on the edge, which will protect the plastic from any damage. But make sure it is wider than the affected area, because the rust spot is usually bigger than it seems through the paint. Now we need to remove the rust. You can do so with sandpaper and lots of elbow grease, or make your life easier and speed things up with a cordless drill and a wire wheel or sanding pad attachment. You need to make sure all the rust is removed, so don't stop until the surface is clean and all the orange rust color is gone. It's best practice to sand or wire wheel the material a bit wider than the rust itself, so you're sure you have removed everything. And don't forget to do the inside. This is where the rust often starts, so make sure you remove all the rusted material here too. And don't worry if you create a hole or if the existing hole gets a bit bigger. We'll show you how to easily fill that up. Like we said before, you can perfectly do all this with some sandpaper, but it will take a lot of time if you have a thick layer of rust. So an angle grinder, cordless drill, or Dremel tool with wire brush attachments are the way to go. After the rust removal, there might be some thin flakes sticking up around the rusted hole, especially if you used a wire wheel. It's best to remove them if they are really thin and flimsy, or just bend them back down again. Then bend or hammer the area down a bit so it's lower than the surrounding area. We need to do this because we're going to add filler on top of this area, and if we don't lower it first, we're never going to get it level. Finally, to prevent any remaining rust from spreading, we're brushing on a layer of rust converter. This will protect the bare metal and transform any remaining rust into a paintable surface. The darker the area, the more rust reacted with the rust reformer. So even though it looked clean, there still were some small amounts of rust left behind which are now neutralized. For our Jeep specifically, we also sprayed some zinc spray to prevent any further rust between these two panels, as this is a notorious rust spot for TJs because water gets trapped in between there and starts to rust. With all the rust removed and treated, it's time to fill everything with body filler. First, we need to degrease the surface so everything sticks properly. If you have holes like we do, you need to place a self-adhesive mesh, which holds a metal plate in place behind the hole so it can support the filler and reinforce the area. Make sure the metal plate is slightly bigger than the hole itself. Don't place it on top of the hole because you won't be able to sand the metal mesh smooth with the surrounding panel. For holes this size, you need to first use fiberglass reinforced filler to create a strong base to work on. So put the amount of filler you need on a mixing sheet and mix in the recommended amount of hardener. When mixing, don't stir it as this introduces air bubbles into the mixture and you don't want that. Instead, scoop it up and squash it back down again, spreading it out. Keep doing this until the colored strands of the hardener disappear and your filler has a nice uniform color. After mixing for about half a minute to a minute, apply the body filler to the metal mesh. Really work the first layer in there so it will bond properly and the filler gets squashed through the holes of the metal plate. Then gently add additional layers to fill everything and create a strong base. But you'll have to work at a steady pace because the filler will harden in about 5 minutes time after adding the hardener. Then, after letting it harden for about 30 minutes depending on ambient temperatures, grab a piece of sandpaper and smoothen the surface of the filler. It doesn't need to look good or be level with the rest. This side just needs to be strong. And as you can see, the filler pushed through the metal mesh, creating a strong bond, which is exactly what we want. After filling the top side as well, you can clearly see the strands of fiberglass putty around the filled area, which gives this filler its strength but also makes it harder to work with. After sanding the surrounding surface smooth with 120 grit sandpaper, we're going to use metal filler. To get optimal, long-lasting results, you need to work in different steps. First, you need to create a strong base with fiberglass filler as the fibers give strength to bridge and support the hole. Then, you need to fill the rough structure with a strong metal putty to create a hard, fairly smooth base to work on, and then finish it with fine putty. Metal filler is mixed in the same way as fiberglass filler by scooping up and spreading out the two components until it's an even color, but it's a lot easier to apply and work with. It's also suited for heavier repairs, unlike fine putty or filler, which is only meant for pinholes and scratches. So this is going to be perfect to even out the basic repair we did with the fiberglass filler. Then we're going to sand everything smooth again with 120 grit sandpaper to prepare for the fine putty, which will create a final smooth layer before painting. After applying the fine putty, let it dry and then sand it, starting with 120 or 180 grit. You might be asking why we apply the fine putty to such a large area compared to the repair. That's because the surrounding area isn't perfectly level, which we're evening out this way. And because the paint on this fender is 25 plus years old and in bad condition, we're going to respray it entirely. The great thing about body filler is that you can reapply and sand it as many times as you want until you get that perfect result you're looking for. Because remember, you'll be able to see even the smallest imperfection through the paint. So make sure you get it perfect now, as you won't be able to hide any flaws with the paint itself. Because it's a large area that's completely flat, we're going to use this perfectly straight 2x3 with a large piece of sandpaper attached to it with thumbtacks. This way it's easier to remove high spots as the wood is hard, unlike most sanding blocks that have a soft, sponge-like material which will apply less pressure on high spots and is more suited for rounded areas. When sanding the fine filler, you want to start with 120 or 180 grit and work your way up to 1000 grit. You want to work in different steps because you need a low grit sandpaper to initially remove the bulk of the material. However, this will leave a rough finish, so you should then remove those scratches with higher grit sandpaper and so on. You could theoretically use 5000 grit sandpaper from the start, but you'll be sanding for ages as this barely removes any material. Then when you're done with the 1000 grit, you need to start wet sanding and go up to 5000 grit to get that perfect finish. You want the edges to feather, as you can see here, which is a great sign that the transition is super smooth. You need to be able to close your eyes and run your fingers across the repair without feeling anything. Remember, if you can feel it with your fingers, you'll definitely see it through the paint. Now that everything is prepped for painting, we're going to remove the old dirty masking tape and tape everything off with fresh tape so no dirt or debris from sanding the filler falls in our fresh paint. When this is done, we only need to wet sand the rest of the paint so the new paint will stick properly. It's easy to tell if you have missed a spot, as the sanded area has a dull look to it, while the area you missed will still look shiny. Just quickly sand it as well and you're done. Then cover everything you don't want overspray on with plastic. Wipe everything down with degreaser so the paint can stick properly and you're ready for the next step, painting. We're first going to use 2 to 3 coats of primer, which will help the base coat stick properly. The first coat should be applied pretty thin and serves as a base for the other coats to hold on to, so it's normal if the color underneath still shines through. Don't try to get full coverage with the first coat because this is too thick for a single coat and will start to run. Instead, work with multiple thin coats to get a nice result. It's better to apply 4 thin coats than 2 thick ones that might start to run. We used a thick filler primer, which means that we can wet sand it to remove the last tiny flaws that potentially remain. So after wet sanding with 5000 grit, it's time for our 2K base coat. Degrease the surface one last time to remove all the particles left behind from wet sanding. And as you can see, we covered the plastic with paper around our fender. That's because the plastic releases the overspray quite easily while the paper holds on to it. And we don't want to have paint flakes falling in our freshly painted fender, which would ruin the result. To get a nice, even result, you should spray from about 10 inches away in smooth motions, maintaining the same distance the entire time. Each pass should overlap the previous one by half or more. But remember, every type or brand of spray paint is different, so some might apply a lot more paint than others or have a different spray pattern. So what you can do is try it on a piece of cardboard first so you have an idea of the amount of paint and the pattern. And if you're not sure about the spraying distance, start from further away and slowly go closer with each pass until you're satisfied with the distance. And always check your specific paint's instructions and drying times in between coats to get optimal results. Just look at how good it looks already after only one coat. We can't wait to see the final result. The next coat should be applied a bit thicker, but be careful that the paint doesn't start to run. Apply the final coat of base coat and make sure that everything is perfectly covered and no spots are forgotten. Now we're going to use the same technique to apply the clear coat. But this time we're going to end with a final coat that's thicker than the previous two. By doing this, the clear coat will flow better and we will have less orange peel. But in our case, we still want some orange peel to match the rest of the paint, so we're not going to go for a perfect smooth finish. Remember, you need to remove the masking tape while the paint is dried to the touch but hasn't fully hardened yet. Otherwise, the edges might flake off and ruin your hard work. And take a look at that result. A beautiful straight edge that doesn't flake. You can clearly see the soft paint letting go instead of flaking off like hard paint would. We can't wait to see what it will look like after the paint has fully hardened in a couple of days' time. And when all the tape is removed and the paint hardened, it's time to admire the final result. From rusted paint bubbles that ended up being a moonscape of rust holes to a beautiful edge that looks like it never was rusted in the first place. And it's even more impressive when we look at the driver's side. Here we went from a rusted crack in the paint to a huge hole in the fender which we had to support with fiberglass filler. But look how it turned out, like it just left the factory. We fixed the rust holes without welding, stopped it from spreading, and made it look like new. And now you can too. Thanks for watching. If you liked our video, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share. It helps out the channel a lot. And don't forget to hit that bell button so you don't miss any of our uploads. More videos are on the way, so we'll see you on the next one.